Ki ngā mea mō te rōpū hītori, te hāhimihe nari ki Aotearoa, tēnā koutou, ma te atua koutou e manaki, i tēnei rā. Kei te tautoko o ngā kupu o Ben, o te kingi tūheitia po te tau te whero, te tua whitu me te kāhui riki katoa, ki Waikato Tainui, ki ngā motu whānui, ma te atua rātou e manaki i tēnei rā. E ngā hoa mai tēnā koutou. It's a privilege to be with you. I recognize a number of friends and colleagues, so it's basically you're offering me a chance to chat with friends, which I value enormously. I thank Ben just now for his kind words. We're colleagues, obviously, in this part of the island, and to acknowledge the fact that at least Ben and I, and maybe some others, are in the realm of King Tūheitia and his family, but also in this task of the Anglican Historical Society. I was delighted to be asked to talk about the book I was writing, partly because of your own mahi and your own agenda. For example, you say on your website, where you stand determines what you see and what you don't see. It also determines the angle you see it from. A change in where you stand changes everything. And that's from Steve DeShazer on your website there. And I don't think you could have a better introduction to what I've been asked to talk about, because the Anglican Historic Society has done some remarkable work, which, by the way, has helped a number of church-based treaty reconciliation issues over land. I won't go into details, but your role and the role of other historians and archivists has been absolutely crucial in restorative justice research. And for that reason alone, it's an honor to spend a little time with you this afternoon. But if you take that website from Steve, that statement, I would say that what I was doing during a COVID lockdown was guided by that idea. It seems to me there are at least 5 places that you can stand when you write history at the moment, particularly Anglican history. There are probably many more than the ones I've just garnered together this afternoon, but I would say, for example, there is a largely Pākehā-based worldview, position, paradigm, which is of enormous value. And a number of your papers reflect the professionalism, academic scholarship, and rigor that world honours and has always upheld since the Benedictine monasteries of the 6th century, maybe much earlier than that. But within that Pākehā worldview, standing there, determining what you see and what you don't see, and the changes people in that position can make. Women and men, for example, different ages from within that paradigm, differently gendered perspectives and so on. That's one position, which is fluid. It's not fixed or static. It evolves all the time. Secondly, there is, I think, a Pākehā place or space where living alongside the Māori world, like Michael King, enables them to reach with permission and proof texting into Māori experience and with their permission record it. But it's as a Pākehā. And Michael was honest about that in Te Puia, being Pākehā, and other books. I saw him 2 weeks before he died and we discussed this very thing. Then thirdly, there is a position or a space or a place which is as if it were on a bridge, which is trafficked by Māori and Pākehā together. And maybe you can imagine a little gatehouse in the middle of the bridge where Māori and Pākehā actually spend a lot of time together. In other words, the two worlds cross-pollinate, the two worlds have a confluence. And both parties on that little gatehouse in the middle of the bridge benefit from each other's position and space and view. And that's obviously got the gender issues, the age issues as well, all the way through it. Then there's another position, which I would say is, in my experience, the 4th position, which is Māori, Tūturu Māori, writing and reaching out into the bicultural world, which includes lots of Pākehā. And so they would write things that, or record things or analyze things that totally recognize, say, partnership in the treaty, or Hugh Kawhara was good at this. He wrote different perspectives on the Treaty of Waitangi, and he named and claimed some Pākehā ones and some Māori ones, and his view of the Māori and Pākehā ones. Then lastly, I would say there's a position, space or a place, which is closer to the Hirini Ka Hahi Mihinari book recently, which is as a Māori speaking about Te Ao Māori, Te Hahi Mihinari Māori, and in that sense, speaking with and for, by, with, for Māori, and not trying to name and claim Pākehā understanding, but speaking to both worlds from a totally Māori position. And that's perhaps an artificial distinction on all five. I found myself on the bridge, I think, when I was writing this book. And I know the Anglican Historic Society wants us to move into Māori bicultural and Māori by Māori for Māori history perspectives in the future more than has been possible so far. But I would put myself in the middle of that range of options. And I say that because I live in a Māori household and have done for over 40 years, and I speak Māori in my house. My grandchildren speak Māori, and I get addressed and challenged by Māori perspectives all the time. So I'm aware that I'm a Pākehā, but I'm also constantly being addressed in every detail of life by the Māori world. It happens to be an Anglican Māori world. So in that sense, there's a bridge, because all the members of my house are Anglican, but they all speak Māori, they all understand protocols, customs, ways of doing things in a tikanga Māori way, and more specifically, Ngāti Pāhuwera ki mohaka, ki Ngāti Kahungunu. I'm not Māori, I'm a Pākehā living in that world. So that's a long-winded explanation for why I wrote this from the perspective I did. Let me just have a quick trek through it and explain why I chose the people I did and what I think they might have to say to us today, and to the bridge and to Pākehā and Māori perspectives on history in particular. So I think I've got help from the screen coming up. Yep, Nō reira nei te āwhina mōku is the name of the book. It's From Where Will My Help Come, from the Psalm, and it's picked up the crisis of COVID, but then gets us into 12 stories of crisis in the history of our country from an Anglican, largely Anglican point of view, and what people did about that crisis. Where did their help come from? And what can we learn from what they perceived as help? We go to the next one. Thank you. I began with Te Ariki Nui Te Ātairangi Kāhu, the Māori Queen, because of her royal mana, and also because I think of all of the examples I chose, she was like a high-flying hawk, or the dawn flight of the hawk, a panoramic view of history, panoramic view of Pākehā Māori interaction from a Māori worldview. And the reason I felt I was on the gatehouse in the middle of the bridge with her was because I knew her for over 20 years. At Tūranga Waiwai, we often talked, often said karakia in front of her, often had meals with her. And I felt if the king gave permission for me to write about her and saw the text, it was okay to do it. And so I sent him the text, and he agreed to it, and was pleased that I had tried to describe her from my position with the words I chose. So that was where we got to. One of the things about her that I think is interesting from the Anglican Historical Society point of view, which is in the book on page 15, is basically this. When she was asked to talk about Māori and Pākehā history of the gospel, and that, of course, in those early days meant Anglican, Catholic, and Wesleyan, and then later Presbyterian, she said this: for their language, meaning Māori language written down in the gospel, particularly Luke's gospel in the first place, first full gospel written in Māori, our ancestors trudged the landscape simply to bring and secure printed copies of the good news brought by the Pākehā missionaries. So these were the two treasures sincerely sought by our ancient warriors, the good news and their language set down on paper. The Pākehā ancestors initiated both, and I wonder how we can show our appreciation to our two sets of ancestors. I think of the vision of that ancestor of ours, meaning a forebear monarch. This man looked into the future and hoped for a multi-race of people to rise in a world of harmony. And then the famous saying, what he said, there is but one eye of the needle through the white, the black, and the red thread must pass. After I am gone, hold fast to love, to the law, and to the religion of Christ. Therefore, let the heart dictate the learning of our language, and let the world know we still live. It's a massive Māori hope, of course, to survive, endure, recover, and regroup and re-enter. Only our God can guide and lead us in keeping alive this precious gift that God bequeathed to our ancestors. And so she has this extraordinary view of Pākehā Māori hāhi ngā tangata katoa history, which I think has a beauty about it that is incomparable. And it was looking for the win-win promises of the treaty. It was looking for a confluence of experience and best practice by both parties. So that's why I chose her and I put her there first. Second slide. This gentleman is a fascinating person because he's the first scholarly Pākehā to, with Susan and Beatrice, Robert Mounsell, married to Susan and later Beatrice, Robert, Susan and Beatrice, to write down a full Bible in Māori only because he had a master's degree from Ireland, because he was trusted by Māori tohunga in the Tuakau area, and because the way he rendered Māori as a scholar was highly regarded. He lived in an almost totally Māori world in the beginning before he later retired to Auckland. And because of that, he ended up with this extraordinary biblical record that then was totally cremated in fire. You imagine translating the entire Bible into Māori and then having it all immolated. So he started again and did it again. A lot of midrash there on hope, resilience, endurance, bicultural partnership of the highest scholarly regard, both ways. And so I thought he was important. Next one. Then the CMS tradition all over Aotearoa is about pear trees and peach trees. Wherever they went, the CMS planted pear and peach trees. They were new to Aotearoa. They are now being grafted and transplanted over the place. We have some in the cathedral in Hamilton, some at Mahimehinari Anglican Action, Kirikiriroa. We have many of them planting everywhere from those missions. And Thomas Chapman, who started one of the first orchards, is a parable of hoping against hope, because based at Tangai and on Makoia Island in Rotorua, his transplanted pear trees failed again and again and again. Some were stolen, some were burned in a fire. He just kept replanting them. And eventually, in the book, I talk about the parable of the pear trees, where we see that Anne and Mary Jane, with Thomas Chapman, and I Haia Te Ahu and Rangi Roaka, the two partners, families of missions, Pākehā and Māori equally, seeded the gospel like a pear tree orchard, like the horticulture of the gospel itself in the parables. And he, I thought, was worth, I mentioned this huge commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi, a massive despair when the treaty was breached, when land was taken or snookered or stolen. He mourns it in his letters, but he believes in the parable of the pear trees to let it plant, seed itself and fruit again, like Christian mission, and it does, of course, and it's coming back now. He was right about that. Next one. The death of Tarore of Waharoa at the age of 12 at the Wairerea Falls, which you can see on the screen. Child martyr, she was bearing the Gospel of Luke at the time in Māori. She'd become a child oracle. Crowds of 300 or 400 gathered by her father, Ngā Kuku, and her great uncle, Tara Pipipi to Waharoa, later Wiremu Tamihana, gathered Ngāti Hauā to listen to this child talk the parable of the Good Samaritan, prodigal son, the great feast, the unjust judge, as a kind of just an oral tradition event, like the first reciting of the parables by Jesus. And it had this catalytic, evocative effect from this child. And she's then murdered at this place. But then her father and her great uncle work with the gospel of the Beatitudes to reconcile with their enemies, and had a great feast using that parable in Luke to gather everyone together and end the war. Remarkable story. Next one. Mary Ann Priest, along with James Priest, the first Pākehā couple to live in the Urewera in 1842, started the first missions, 27 little Bible schools run by Māori, for Māori, with Māori, largely independent of her. She trained them to read, she trained them to catechize, and then they spread out as far as Waikare Moana to seed their own Bible schools. And it was from this Bible school ripple effect through Tūhoe that the great energy, I suppose, and vision of Rua Kenana, using biblical texts from the abandoned mission that Mary Ann and James had left behind when they went to Te Whaiti to retire, and running missions all along the coast. They took no land, they kept no land, they stole no land. They ended up with a piece they purchased in Coromandel, still called Priest's Point after them today, and the little land around it was sold to Anglican missions, and it now funds a Pihopatanga ministry fund. Next slide. Hene Te Kirikaramu, Jane Foley, the hero of the Battle of Gate Pa, using the Epistle to the Romans to demonstrate to her English soldier enemies that the compassion of Christ could reach across. If your enemy's thirsty, give them drink. If your enemy's hungry, feed them. She crawls across the no man's land between the defending Pa at Gate Pa, Pukehinahina, and the approaching Durham Light Infantry, wounded soldiers, particularly officers lying, dying, badly hurt. She crawls across and gives them water, prays with them, and then creeps back. Henare Wiremu Taratoa, an ordinand at St. John's College, had come down, gave her that text from Romans, and she carried it out. So did he. He was later shot at Tiranga 2 weeks later, but she survived. And her story and all its background and aftermath, I thought was important, not just the dramatic bit at Gate Pa, but the extraordinary courage and resilience she had till she died in Rotorua at the age of 92. Next one. Hare Maihi Ruarangi, buried at Hopu Hopu near here, the St. Damien, if you will, of Molokai, the Francis of Assisi of the Waikato area, ministering to people with smallpox because they needed communion, because they wanted prayers, catches it himself and dies in his 40s like Francis and like Damien of Molokai, and buried him there where the church was. He's still there. People stop and pray there frequently. It's just an ordinary parish priest who reached across to Māori and Pākehā patients at risk to his own life. Very simple person, trained well at St. John's College, came through flying colours, but just embedded himself in the fate and destiny of the people in his parish, a number of whom had smallpox. And we say, he being dead yet speaks. Next one. This is, of course, Suzanne Aubert, probably going to be Catholicism's first New Zealand saint. The case is before the Vatican at the moment. I have the honour of taking a Māori chief, Mahiwi Tremona, who's my brother-in-law, to the Pope to argue the case from an ecumenical point of view and on behalf of Māori chiefs, that she was the opposite of the colonising imperialism of Governor Grey. She wanted to live humbly, mostly penniless, very simply with the Māori world, to respond to it as a partner where they wanted her, and that turned out to be rongoa Māori, that is medicine, herbal medicine. She developed Māori medical techniques alongside French herbal remedies, and she has become, I won't go on about her, you know her well, the largest funeral of any woman in New Zealand Pākehā recorded history, and buried at Island Bay, Wellington, that will and is becoming a shrine because of her aroha, her naturopathy, her aromatherapy, her solidarity, extremely short person with an extremely tall, if you will, mana in our history. Next slide. This is a young girl shot of Winifred Leisner, a very interesting example of a very wealthy heiress in Gisborne, Anglican, who spent most of her adult life giving it away. One of the first Pākehā to speak Māori in Gisborne. She had a riding school for everybody. She ran St John Ambulance in partnership with others. She started Sunday schools at the parish church, Holy Trinity Gisborne. But most importantly of all that Pākehā wealth that she acquired from her father, the MP, and their vast mansion beside the river in Gisborne, she gave away during the course of her life, died with nothing. Clearly a Franciscan oblate type behavior. And I think respected by Māori because she lived the open door Acts 4 lifestyle recommended there by Luke, to share everything you have with others, house, clothing, food. And she's a very eccentric and delightful example of that. Very fond of Winifred. Next one. Canon Wita Tauhuata, pastorate priest during the Second World War, Waipatu, Wairoa Mohaka, Waikato, very close to the Māori Queen, and he helped crown her. I won't go into his details, but he led people with a song. He was so big-hearted in both cultures, but firmly rooted in his own, extremely brave during World War II, started Māori development initiatives. The urban marae in Hamilton was one of his and others' visions. It's still going today. Next one. Puti Murray, Māori woman priest, the first Māori woman to be ordained. Again, matriarch, a kind of cross between Mother Teresa and Indiana Jones, an extraordinary person. Te whakaruru hau o mere, the Māori women's residential community in Auckland continues today because of her aroha, her care for people off and on the street as an expression of her priesthood, and some true Māori values, which I've tried to describe with permission, coming from a totally Māori way of seeing people and seeing manuhiritanga, that is hospitality to strangers, and particularly rooted in this saying that we've recorded here at the end of her chapter on behalf of the pihovatanga o te tai tokorau for her. They said this, thinking of her, e te ariki tuia te rangi e tūnei, tuia te papa e takoto nei, tuia mātou katoa e tēnei pihovatanga ki te here e kore e taia te wewete, tuia ki te whakaaro pai, tuia ki te whakaaro nui, tuia ki te whakaaro hohonu, ki au tonu ai mātou ki a koe te mana te tapu, te ihi te wehi. God of life, grant us a glimpse and an insight into your kingdom. Give us a vision of your purpose and guide us with your wisdom. Pour into us the grace to follow where you lead and to walk humbly with our neighbour, so that we may accomplish all our endeavours according to your most holy will. And the bishop placed a photo of Puti on the covers of a large Kuiamarangi document from which this prayer was read. Next slide. This is one of the last public photos taken of Paul Reeves before his diagnosis with cancer, which took him about 9 months after diagnosis. But I chose this one because he was a bishop, but this is taken in Taranaki, and he's descended from one of the related whānau of Te Whiti, the prophet from Parihaka in Taranaki. And he's also a tower of strength across the Diocese of Waiapu, the Diocese of Auckland, and across the primatial roles of the Anglican Church in this country. An historian himself, I think he'd be delighted with the efforts of the New Zealand Anglican Historic Society. But I chose him because he faced a lot of the contemporary issues that are still alive today. And I tried to describe them in the light of hindsight, looking, for example, at the Springbok tour and Mandela and his relationship with him. Bishop Desmond Tutu and that whole apartheid issue, supporting the homosexual law reform bill through the House of Bishops, trying to work on citizens for rolling by challenging the New Zealand public to think about their values at the time of an election, which I think history has to some extent vindicated him. Difficult things like moving a wooden Gothic pro-cathedral across a road, how to preside over that with Irenicism. Governor-General, kind of wit and wisdom, probably the first Governor-General to proclaim the treaty alongside the Māori Queen. So these two bookend the people part of the book. Māori Queen at the beginning, Paul at the end. They appeared on television together saying the treaty is a sacred covenant, the treaty is a founding document of our country. And I go into that a wee bit at the back with a theology or an exegetical treatment of the treaty in Māori and English, using Sir Hugh Kāwharu's words as an Anglican, but also anthropologist scholar, to talk about that as we understand it today. There's also a haka there to propel us forward with a Pauline conversion type attitude to history and what lies in front of us. Things like COVID, a look in St. Faith's Āwhina as a shrine for bicultural spirituality, talked a bit about that, and so on. It's probably enough to give you a reason for or impressions of that piece of work. Happy to have a kōrero or take questions.
I am entirely dependent upon Ben's review because I haven't managed to get the book yet. No, I've tried. But in Ben's review, he refers to your emphasis with the people you've highlighted, the emphasis on their formation through community, through whānau, through the fellowship of the church, that they weren't just gifted individualists. Yeah. And that seemed to me to be a very strong point to make at this point of our history. You may wish to comment further.
Yes, I was originally tempted to think of heroes as a person, but the more they wouldn't have regarded themselves that way. And the more I looked at them, the more they are the Ubuntu principle, we are because, I am because we are. And the people we notice are not necessarily even the main reason for their effectiveness. It's often the people around them across, and that's true of Jesus as well. Of course, we don't have some of the activity with his brothers and mother, and what we have is what he said or what other people thought he said. And I think that's true of people we could identify in history today, that they're often standing on the shoulders of other people we can't see. Sometimes we can see them, and if we do enough homework, we can find out a cohort, really, of which they are one symptom or one sign. But all of these people I mentioned this afternoon would have been just simply unable to do anything without a big cohort of solidarity and the people who raised them, the people who influenced them. For example, Winifred Leisner, and I said she was a very wealthy Pākehā who was one of the first to learn Māori and gave away all her money to the community. It's now clear that her mother's faith had a huge effect on her, and I mentioned that in the book. And if you ask why is Winifred, and there's two other people in the main title who worked with her with the horse riding school, and she is only explicable because of Joyce Toome, Ken Herraville, Les Woodward, and the horses. So, and often too, I think, as well as the people that produce someone we notice, there's also the circumstances. So, for example, Winifred became famous in Gisborne because she decided to create an aunt's army of women medics on horses that would hide up in the hills and come down the valleys if the Japanese invaded and started, say there was a war and people were wounded. She would, this riding, nursing cavalry would charge down unexpectedly and create a MASH hospital army tent for all the wounded, and then disappear back up into the bush again. And it was that sort of courageous eccentricity that brought her to the attention of the Gisborne press. They'd already known about the riding school. Two of my sisters went on it. But it's that sort of thing. And World War II put Wita Tohuata in a unique and extraordinary situation. He became well known because he refused to wear a helmet, did not want to be identified as a shooter, but crawled along the trenches and across the no man's land like Hene Te Kirikaramu. Hene Te Kirikaramu is only explicable partly because of going to Gate Pa to save her brother from being shot. And then she does the water giving to the British dying officers because of Henare Wirimu Taratoa, who got his training from St. John's College in Auckland. So there's all these sort of things, these confluences that swirl all the time. And I was trying to reflect that a bit. I tried in some of the photos to get groups around them. The best is Maihi Ruarahi in the book. There's, I think, 12 people in that photo, and he's the bottom right. And Paul Reeves is with 6 other people in Government House. The boy carvers who put in the first Māori carving into Government House came through because of Paul. And he came through because one of his relatives from Parihaka came to see him one day when he was the vicar of Okato and said, here's your whakapapa, here's your people. And Paul didn't know much about that. In the book it says that day changed his whole life. Hadn't had the visit, would have been very different. So, yeah, Janet.
Yeah.
That's good.
Good, thank you very much. I'm going to have an opportunity to thank you formally later, but I was very interested in the people that you chose. Some of them are well known, but many of them I hadn't known about, including Winifred. A few of them I'd actually met.
Yes.
And I just mention a couple of links because they are also links with the AHS. I was very interested in James and Mary Ann Priest because the latest piece I wrote was on Eunice Priest, who was one of their daughters and who was a missionary in China for about 40 years, going in the 1920s with Kathleen Hall, who is much better known. But Eunice worked for the SPG through the years of revolution, of civil war. She was interned by the Japanese. There was drought, there was starvation, poverty, extremely hard conditions, and she gave her life, well, not her whole life, because when she was unable to return to China because of the political situation, she worked for the Maori mission on the East Coast and was in charge of the mission house at Manatuki for several years. I think she was about 70 when she retired. So that's a nice connection with the priests and shows the faith, the desire to sow the gospel going on to another generation. And you mentioned St. Faith's as a bicultural church, and outside St. Faith's there is a very large tomb, or 2 tombs, I think from memory, standing up, concrete, of Piripiri and Heta Munro. He was a priest in the Waiapu diocese, and she was the first synodswoman, I believe, in the world to be in an Anglican synod, in the Waiapu diocesan synod. So that is a remarkable achievement, and I was so moved when I saw their graves there.
Yes, yes, and as Eunice, I met when I was 7, but she died shortly after that. But Mary Ann Priest was her grandmother, so you're quite right. It's exactly that line, and she used to say apparently that her faith came from Mary Ann, her grandmother's knee, if you will, and that's why she did what she did. And she had as you've researched and a paper you've written, I went to Chinese society or Chinese Kiwi society thing in Hamilton recently, talking about Kathleen and Eunice, where the Chinese community talked about the difference those two Kiwi women made in China. You know, hardworking, sleeves rolled up, no colonial patronage, just human to human, team human, and they're highly regarded like rewi ali in China today. Although they had to leave, it wasn't a Chinese request to leave, it was impossible circumstances. So I think, and they're both in stained glass at the end of St. Mary's Parnell wooden pro-cathedral, right at the end there. Yes, thank you for mentioning her. Extraordinary person.
How fascinating that you actually met her.
Yes, I did. I remember it. I was 9, just very, very briefly. She ended up in the Māori missions in Waikato.
No, Waipu.
Waipu, was it? No.
Yes,
Two people say she visited them, but maybe it was just a visit.
Kathleen Hall ended up in Waikato.
Oh, did she? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway, that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I could make a quick comment in case there's another question just simmering. One of the things that prompted me was the very good and powerful work done by some who are challenging us about codependence on colonization as a church. And that challenge is good. It's necessary, it's invigorating, and it's healthy. Some of the scholars out of Victoria University, Annie Makairi, for example, not from Victoria, but her writing, like Moths to the Flame, those sorts of books, and certainly Soldiers, Spies and Saints, some of the work by Vincent O'Malley, which again I find invigorating and useful, nevertheless don't appear to have taken into account the people in this book who were not consciously agents of colonization and were certainly not inadvertently mimicking colonization. 19th century examples in this book they came in with some of that paradigm, of course, but the great chain of being and so on, but they slowly started to morph and evolve in largely Māori contexts, certainly over land loss, justice issues, treaty, prognosis, that kind of thing. They start to change. And you see them evolving their writings to be much more pro-treaty, pro-Māori, pro-justice, pro-equity than, say, Governor Grey, or certainly General Cameron. So I tried to, without disagreeing with the critique, to show that there is another strand in the pattern which we can recognize as a gospel strand with all its weaknesses and ethnocentrism, of course, but it does exist. And if these people had had their way politically, I think we would have seen a very different unfolding of history. One of the interesting reactions I've had is from a Māori scholar friend who said that by the age of 9 on the marae, he was brought up in a totally Māori world. By the age of 9, he had worked out that Jesus of Nazareth wasn't a British colonial officer. In fact, Jesus had a view of empires which was very different than Governor Grey, for example.
David, I warm very much to your sharing with us, and reminded of the parables of Jesus, of the soil and the word of God growing in a variety of ways. They often use parables of growth, seed, flowering out of growth, and how these people that you've placed before us as examples of walking the way of Jesus were nurtured in good seed, in good ground.
Yes.
Even
Yes.
possibly by people who didn't know Jesus, but God was alive and well, and the seeds brought by some of the missionaries were able to flower, and And of course, many of the first missionaries were Māori themselves.
Yes, I think that's an extremely important point, which you'll be well aware of more than even me or most, but there's a Māori deacon at Victoria University in the law faculty, whose name has just escaped me, starts with M, I think. Anyway, she's pointed out through historical analysis, that roughly 80% of the gospel communication, catechesis, evangelization was by Māori, for Māori, with Māori. The crucial 20%, of course, from Pākehā and all the other missions which I refer to in the book, was printing press. Thank you, Māori Stevens, tēnā koe. Thank you, Peter. Māori. She's pointed this out. And the Pākehā seedbed of printing press translation was absolutely crucial, but it was only 20% of transmission, 80%, often without Pākehā missionaries in view. And Tarore of Waharoa is a good example. Charlotte Brown, who taught her to read, who brought Te Rongo Paiaruka, the Gospel of Luke in Māori, to Waharoa, gave it to her great uncle, Wiremu Tamihana, the great prophet of the 19th century. Charlotte had to leave after just over a year because it was unsettled times, because of the conflict that Tarore and her father and great uncle later ended. But she had to go back with Albert Nesbitt Brown, to Tauranga. And that meant Tarore, Wiremu Tamihana, Ngā Kuku were teaching themselves from what they had learned to read, and then communicating it in Ngāti Hauā by themselves without any Pākehā present at all. And Ben Tahara used to say, reflecting off this 80% by Māori, for Māori, with Māori transmission, he often used to say to me, Waiaho Tahara, a good friend of many of us, he said, the question that fascinates him is, why did his tupuna find the gospel fascinating by itself? In other words, in Māori, in a Māori context. Why was his tupuna fascinated with it? Partly Māori written down, of course, for the first time, but the turns of phrase, the message, the spirituality, the ethic, the kingdom imperative is fascinated him. And that's why it spread osmotically like a ripple quite often. And that's not colonization, that's cultural appreciation and evolution when something beautiful and intriguing comes along.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā koe, te pehipa. Sorry, pehipa. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you very much, Archbishop David. It's right, or it was right, that as we seek as a society to broaden our perspectives and participation in order to better reflect and record the history of our whole church, not just the Pākehā part of it, that you should be our speaker today, because I don't think we could have had someone better to introduce us, or perhaps reintroduce us, encourage us in our work. The 5 positions that you outlined at the beginning are very interesting, and we could each spend some time perhaps placing ourselves on that range of 5. And we could, those who haven't read the book yet, I would heartily recommend you to do so. But your life, your ministry, your scholarship, all manifest your own commitment to an experience of being a bicultural Anglican. This is not the Church of England, but Te Hahi Mihunare. Some of the people you have chosen to write about are well known, others not so well known. Some may be well known to Māori, but not to Pākehā, and of course, vice versa. And I wonder if, in fact, on the whole, Māori are more aware of their ancestors in the church than Pākehā are, because I think we have a great lack of knowledge about many people who were outstanding in their time and whose influence was great. But the people that you have chosen are all notable for their contribution to sowing the gospel in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I just wondered when you mentioned Gray and Cameron, they were both agents of the Crown. I believe Gray was fluent in Te Reo and knew many Maori leaders and would talk to them and so on, but he had a particular position. And of course, Cameron was simply sent here as an aggressor, I would say. But neither of them lived with Maori. And I think that was one of the things that is striking about missionaries, that they lived with Maori and to a large extent were dependent on them and got to know them in a completely different way from people like Gray.
Right.
And as they began to know them and to understand more of the people and their culture, as you say, their ideas evolved. They didn't remain stuck where they were when they arrived. They evolved, and some of them evolved a bit too far for the CMS. Much work needs to be done for us to gain deeper and wider, more inclusive understandings of our history as Anglicans in this country, as New Zealanders as a whole, as Pākehā, but our perspective, our focus is particularly on being Anglican. The Anglican Historical Society has a small role to play in this, and you, Archbishop, through your book and through your talk, have given us a great stimulus to continue and develop our work. Ngā mihi nui. And as we're on Zoom, I'll ask you to wave your hands in appreciation.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, everybody. Privilege.